Hey there. If you're anything like me, you've got this massive digital library. It's an absolute treasure trove of highlights and notes, right? But finding that one specific idea when you need it, it can feel like trying to find a key you've lost in a house full of locked rooms. Today, we're going to explore 4 really powerful AI readers that can basically pick any of those locks for us. Let's dive in.
Okay, so just picture this for a second. You've spent years, literally years, reading and highlighting all these brilliant passages in, I don't know, dozens, maybe hundreds of books. And now you have a question, something specific, like, what have I read about the psychology of resisting change? That one killer insight could be hiding anywhere. It might be in a psychology textbook, sure, but it could also be in a business book, a history of the Roman Empire, or heck, even a novel you read 3 years ago. So, how do you possibly find it? Well, this challenge actually has a name. It's called the retrieval problem, and it is the central puzzle for anyone trying to build an AI that can work with huge amounts of text. And look, you can't just shove all your books into the AI's memory, what's called its context window, and just hope for the best. The models get totally overwhelmed. They start losing track of information. And the books you've highlighted the most, they tend to just drown out everything else, even if some little-known book holds the real gem you're looking for. So to really get our heads around the solution, we're going to use a really simple metaphor. I want you to imagine that you're hiring an expert to help you out, and you have 4 different candidates, 4 different readers, and each one has a totally unique strategy for tackling your library and finding exactly what you need. So here's our game plan. First, we'll talk a bit more about our drowning digital libraries. Then, we're going to meet our 4 readers. We'll start with a pair called the indexer and the mapper, then move on to the researcher and the scholar. And finally, we'll figure out which one is the best fit for you.
Right. So the heart of the issue is that our best ideas are scattered all over the place. An incredible insight from a Dostoevsky novel might actually connect perfectly to a modern book on behavioral economics, but because they're in separate digital files, our highlights keep them trapped in silos. That is the exact problem we're here to solve. All right, let's meet our first pair of readers, the indexer and the mapper. Now, these two represent 2 fundamentally different ways of thinking about how to organize and search through information. You can think of them as the 2 bedrock strategies that everything else is built on. On the surface, it's actually pretty simple. The indexer is like someone who literally tears out every single passage you've highlighted, scribbles it on an index card, and just throws them all into a giant box. When you ask a question, they just rummage through the pile to find a match. The mapper, on the other hand, is completely different. They painstakingly build this giant, intricate web, charting all the relationships between every single idea before you even ask your first question. So let's peek under the hood of the indexer for a second. The technical name for this approach is Retrieval Augmented Generation, or as you've probably heard it called, RAG. What it does is it breaks your highlights into little chunks, and then it converts each one into a long string of numbers, a vector, that represents its meaning. When you ask a question, it turns your question into numbers too, and then just finds the chunks that are the closest mathematical match. Now, the big advantage here is something called semantic search. It's really cool. If you search for free will, it won't just find those exact 2 words. It's smart enough to find passages about choice, determinism, moral responsibility, because it gets the meaning. But, and this is a huge but, the downsides are massive. By turning a book into a pile of random index cards, you completely destroy its original structure. You lose the author's argument, and it suffers from something called density bias, which means it will almost always pull an answer from the book where you made 300 highlights and ignore the one where you only made 15, even if that second book has the deeper insight. Okay, on to our second reader, the mapper. The tech behind this is called GraphRag, and its whole philosophy is proactive organization. Before you ever ask a single question, it reads your entire library and builds this incredibly detailed knowledge graph. It maps out every person, every concept, and this is the crucial part, how they all relate to each other. The mapper's superpower is something called multi-hop reasoning. It can answer these incredibly complex questions, like how do these 3 different authors in my library all approach the topic of habits? It can do that because it's already mapped the connections and even the contradictions between them. But all that power comes at a steep price. Building that initial graph is super expensive and takes a long, long time. For just a personal library, honestly, it can be a bit like using an industrial crane to hang a picture frame. Total overkill. Okay, so we've covered the 2 basic methods. Now let's bring in the specialists, the researcher and the scholar. These are much more sophisticated strategies, and they're designed for a deeper, more nuanced kind of understanding. So here's the difference in a nutshell. The researcher is dynamic, it's agile, it sits there with your books, and based on your question, it decides on the fly which one to pick up, which chapter to skim, and where to read deeply. The scholar, though, is meticulous. It reads every single book from cover to cover beforehand, creating these beautiful structured notes that preserve the author's original argument from top to bottom. The technical name for the researcher's method is the Recursive Language Model, or RLM. And honestly, this is a total paradigm shift. Instead of us feeding text to the model itself treats your library like an environment it can explore. It's almost like it's sitting at a desk with your books stacked right next to it, deciding for itself, I'll flip through this table of contents, or, okay, I'll read this chapter closely. And then it'll jump to a whole other book when it spots a connection. And the results? They're just staggering. In one test, a standard AI model scored a 0% on a really complex research task. 0. But then they took the exact same model and just gave it this researcher ability to navigate on its own, and it scored a 91%. That is not just an improvement, that's a complete transformation. The AI literally taught itself how to be a better researcher in real time. So the real beauty of the researcher is just how flexible it is. There's no expensive, time-consuming setup, and it's incredibly efficient because it only reads what it absolutely needs to. So what's the catch? Well, its path can be a little unpredictable. Just like a real-life researcher, sometimes it follows a promising lead that just turns into a dead end. And that brings us to our final reader, the scholar. This method, which is called structure-aware indexing, is by far the most deliberate. It reads each book chapter by chapter, but it's not just summarizing. No, it's building a hierarchical, layered understanding of the author's entire argument. It knows that a specific passage in Chapter 2 is actually the setup for a major takedown in Chapter 5. It understands the role that each piece of the text plays in the whole. And you can see the process right here. The scholar creates these nested summaries. It starts way up high with the book's single core idea, then it summarizes each major part, then it drills down to identify each chapter's central claim, and finally it isolates the key evidence for that claim. What it's really doing is preserving the book's intellectual DNA. So the payoff for all this work is immense. The scholar creates the richest possible index because it doesn't just know what was said, it knows how the arguments were built. This allows for true knowledge synthesis. It doesn't just find quotes, it understands the deep context. But as you can probably imagine, this intense, structured reading of every single book makes it by far the most labor-intensive and expensive approach. So there we have it. We've met our 4 readers: the fast indexer, the connected mapper, the agile researcher, and the deep scholar. So the big question is, which one is best? Well, like with any good tool, it really just depends on the job you're trying to do. This table really lays it all out. If you've got a quick, specific question, you're gonna want the fast indexer. If you need to find those hidden connections between different books, you need the mapper. If you're tackling a broad, exploratory topic and you don't even know what you're looking for yet, the agile researcher is your go-to. And when you need to truly, deeply understand the core arguments in your most important books, you deploy the scholar. But here is the crucial point, and maybe the most important takeaway of all. These strategies aren't mutually exclusive. The future isn't about picking just one. The most powerful systems are going to be hybrids that combine these approaches, maybe using the indexer for a quick first pass, deploying the researcher for some exploration, and then relying on the scholar for a deep dive into your most foundational texts. And that really brings us to this final insight, which I just love. We've been talking this whole time about cutting-edge AI, about RAG and knowledge graphs, but what are we really talking about? We're talking about fundamental human strategies for learning. Whether you're building an index, mapping connections, exploring freely, or structuring an argument, these are timeless ways of seeking knowledge. The tools are new. The reading strategies are timeless. So I'll leave you with this question. As you think about organizing your own knowledge, your own learning, it's not just about which AI tool you're going to use. It's about your own strategy. Are you an indexer, a mapper, a researcher, or a scholar? Which reader will you become? Thanks for joining me.